to have visitors, those who come our way. We are glad you found us and appreciate your presence. If you want to go ahead and turn, our first scripture is going to be Romans chapter 2. Romans 2, a couple of verses there. Let me just encourage you to take these flyers. There's a huge stack of these flyers that we had printed up. They're on the table in the foyer as you go out. And I can't begin to tell you how important it is that we give out these invitations and encourage others to be present. And you can take these and just fold them, put them in an envelope and mail them. If you got the email yesterday, you could just download or copy that and email it to your friends. Or, you might want to go out through your neighborhood. I hope to be able to go out my neighborhood. I received the other week, I got home and there was a flyer about this size from Spectrum Cable, TV, and they had been throughout all of our neighborhood. If you were home knocking on the door, then they just stuck this in one of the doors, and that's pretty easy to do. So you can just stick them in a door and hand them out like that, or maybe you can knock and get to meet some of your neighbors that you haven't met yet. But anyway, you can hand these out. But I would encourage you to make a list of at least 2 or 3 dozen people. I'm sure you know that many, even some of your worst enemies, maybe. But just hand these out. Hand them out when you go through a drive-through at McDonald's or the grocery clerk, or I'm sure you can give them out to a lot of strangers, but you can give them out to, I'm sure, the people you know, and you never know what kind of response. The good article on the back is, we are the Church of Christ. And it tells people about the church, and if nothing else, they might come across this in several months or a year or two from now and pick it up and read it. But we hope they'll be able to come to the meeting, and that maybe you can encourage them, check back with them, say, well, would you mind, if they say, well, I don't think but do you mind if I check back with you that Friday or Saturday? Just all kinds of things we can do to ensure the success of the meeting. This morning's going to be a very simple lesson. I always love to do our rules, as you know, but practical and so basic till I think we can really sum it up in the first 2 or 3 minutes. And it's just what's on the board. And that chalk doesn't write very well. But moral and positive law. Oftentimes people will try to justify something based on morality, that they appeal to a sense of morality for their authority. They may say, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. And they're arguing from an ethical perspective. Now, there are so many things that are universally accepted as being immoral. Stealing, adultery, murder, lying in most cases. In Romans chapter 2 here, we find where Paul talks about in verse 14 and 13, let's begin. For the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God. Not the hearers of the law, but the doers of the law. For when the Gentiles, verse 14, do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. Now, I believe what this is saying is that in every human being, there is a sense of morality. And we see this on the part of the Gentiles here. There is a moral compass within us, that the things we mentioned about murder, stealing, adultery, those are universally declared to be immoral. But on the other hand, there is positive law. And we're defining positive like being a good rule. a decree, a stated law that is given by authority. And so, moral law is that which is universally recognized as principles of right and wrong, a moral standard. But positive law is based upon given authority, maybe at a particular place and time. For example, even in school, that, it's wrong to get into a fight, or it's wrong to cheat on a test. That's based on moral principles, isn't it? But I know of some schools that have like a rear door or side door in which it has been decreed for the school authorities that it's wrong to go inside that door during the school hours. Well, that's just a law that's been given at a particular place and time. Nothing moral about going through the wrong door, is it? I mean, there are laws, or was a law in the book in Harrisonburg, maybe even in Charleston, that it was not permitted for a woman to wear high heels walking down the sidewalk. I mean, that law, as far as I remember, was still in the books in Harrisonburg. Or we understand that it's wrong to drive down the left side of the road. Well, these are positive laws, and they're not based upon any moral principles, are they? And so you see the difference in that. Now, when we go to Genesis, we're getting ahead of myself, Exodus, chapter 20, we find the Ten Commandments, and you're familiar with those. And all of these deal with moral principles, moral things that are morally right and wrong. Okay, so we understand that these are moral laws that were given by God, with the exception of the Sabbath. But let's go back to Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 19, and just a couple examples here, where God gives these regulations to the priest and for the people. But notice here, he says in verse 19, Leviticus 19:19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. Is that something that deals with moral issues? No. Why did God not permit them to do these things? Is there anything wrong with that? Well, God just said it. He said, don't do this. And it's not a matter of morality. It's just a stated law that's given in a particular place and time. Look at verse 27 of this chapter. It says, you shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard. Anything morally wrong with that? No. Here again is where God stated a positive law that he intended for them to keep simply because of his authority. We think of murder and adultery and stealing as being worse than some of these other laws or positive laws God gives. Where do we learn that? God doesn't make any distinction between laws that are significant and which ones are not. And what we see in the Old Testament is when men violated moral law, they were punished. Cain committed murder. He violated God's moral law concerning life. Sodom was punished because of their homosexuality. There's David, who committed adultery and suffered the consequences. And so these people were punished for violating God's moral law, like in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. But also we see where people violated positive laws. In the beginning, what command did God give to Adam and Eve? Thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then in Genesis 3, we find where when Eve saw that the tree was good for food and desired to make one wise, and she ate thereof. Anything immoral about eating a piece of fruit? No. It's not a question of morality. It's a matter of what God said. And God said not and they were expected to be obedient. In Leviticus 11, and we talked about some of these examples recently. Leviticus 11, the first couple of verses, talk about the two sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and they offered a strange fire upon the altar. Anything immoral about that? No, it wasn't a question of morality. It was a matter of doing what God said to do and where to offer and for what kind of fire, incense to offer. And we mentioned that a few weeks ago from like First Chronicles 13, verses 7 through 10, and going back to 1 Samuel. But when David built a new ark to transport, built the ox cart from the ark, and Uzzah reached out his hand and steadied the ark. Was there anything wrong with that, moral? No. But God had stated back in Numbers how to transport the ark, thou shalt not touch any of the holy pieces of the furniture. Was that a moral, immoral law that Uzzah violated and suffered the consequences of death? No, it was a law, a positive law that God stated. You're beginning to see the difference in some of this? You see, there were those who were punished for disobedience to God's positive law, just as many were punished for violating God's moral law. If God said not to do it, then he meant what he said. But on the other hand, those who were obedient to God's moral law, they were rewarded. Think of those who kept God's moral law, like Lot, who was vexed in his soul and the immorality around him in Sodom and Gomorrah. Or you think about Joseph, and there he was, and Joseph resisted the temptations of Potiphar's wife to commit adultery. He kept God's moral law, and there are many others we can look at. But there were also those who were obedient to positive law, like in Numbers 21. I think we mentioned the other night in connection with our study in John 3. But when the people were bitten by the poisonous snakes because of their murmuring and complaining, and what happened? God was told Moses to raise up that brazen serpent. And then he said what? Well, when you look on it, you'll be healed. But was there something moral or immoral about the law that God stated? No, nothing moral or immoral about looking on that brazen serpent. But if they didn't do it, it was disobedient to what God said to do, the positive law, and that is look upon it. Or in Joshua 6, when the people walked around the city of Jericho, and on the seventh day, the trumpet sounded, and the people gave a shout, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, here they were, walking around the city these several days. Anything moral or immoral about that? No. It's what God said to do. And they kept that commandment, God's positive commandment. Or in 2 Kings 5, we often refer to that example of Naaman, the leper. And he had to obey God's positive law. He was told to go dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Now, is there anything of moral value about going down to the river Jordan? No. It's what God stated. And God gave that command to Naaman. You see, obedience to these positive laws that did not involve any kind of morality were rewarded also as obedience to the moral law. Well, was there ever a time when there was a moral law involved, or a moral, let's just say, was there ever a time in which there was an issue of morality and conflict with the positive law? Can you think of one? What about Genesis 22? When Abraham was tested by God, and he was told to do what? He was told to go and offer his son Isaac. Well, that's the command God gave. Put your son to death, offer him as a sacrifice. Well, that just wouldn't seem right to us from a moral perspective. He would be taking a life, committing murder. And so it seems like we have a conflict, a moral law that's violated by a positive law that God stated. Well, what was Abraham to do? What did God expect of him? Well, he just did what God said. And God blessed him. But he was willing to violate a moral law to do what God said to do. Now, of course, God intervened and stayed the hand of Abraham. But you see, even in that conflict, God gave a positive law. And that made it not an issue necessarily of morality, but it was what God said to do. In the New Testament, what about the law? Well, the moral law. 9 of those 10 commandments. This could be a technician. Okay. Get off track. So, in the New Testament, what about moral law? Well, 9 of the 10 original commandments are reinstated, as it were. Some say carried over, but we're found in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, other places. These moral principles that God gave from the beginning, even before the 10 commandments. But in the law, these things are stated in the law of Christ. Remember last week our lesson? This lesson ties into that. We'll talk about morality. But Ephesians chapter 5, talking about fornication, lying, adultery, all those things. 1 Corinthians 6, flee fornication, talks about sexual immorality. All these scriptures we're familiar with, it talks about God expects us to obey and keep his standard of morality. But there are also positive commands, aren't there? Colossians 3:17, we often quote, whatsoever you do, do in word or in deed, all in the name of the Lord by his authority. And look at 1 John 2. There are many scriptures, and you're familiar with those, for our need for authority, where God states that we are to keep his commandments. Well, how does John put that here? 1 John chapter 2, in verse 4, said, he who says, I know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected by him. By this we know that we are in him. And I skipped over verse 3. By this we know that we know him if what? We keep his commandments. And so we have positive law that's given by the authority of Christ and his apostle. An example of that is like Titus 1, 1 Timothy 3, and the qualifications for elders. An elder is to be the husband of one wife. Well, can a man serve as an elder who is a single man like Paul was? And from a moral perspective, we may not see the value of that being stated. Or 1 Timothy 2 and 11 and 12, where women are to be in subjection and that women are not to teach or have authority over the man. Somebody says, well, I don't see anything wrong with a woman preaching. Well, I tell you what, I don't either. It's not a question of what's moral or immoral. It's a matter of what God said. And it's a matter of our obedience. And we go on and on. 1 Corinthians 16, Acts 20, verse 7, it's on the first day of the week that we come together and partake of the Lord's Supper. We understand the authority, the law that's given there. Well, I don't see anything wrong with having the Lord's Supper on a Friday night, or maybe when we meet on Wednesday night. Well, from a moral perspective, it may not be anything wrong with it. But God states it with necessary inference in his commands, and this is the time that he has selected. You know, the Sabbatarians, those who declare their day of worship to be on the Sabbath, they argued that the seventh day commandment was a moral law. And that moral law is to continue on and on throughout eternity. Well, that's true of the 10 commandments, or 9 of them, but not the Sabbath, as we said. And we will take the time to look up the scriptures. I'll be happy to give them to you. But remember, Deuteronomy 5, specifically, God stated that these commandments that he gave was for who? For the nation of Israel, for those people. And it was not given to the Gentiles. Nehemiah 9, in verse 13, we read about the Sabbath as is referred to in Genesis, and God rested on the Sabbath. And we see the background and the basis of the Sabbath law. But it wasn't a universal law. It wasn't a matter of morality. It was the law that God gave to a certain people in a certain time. And Christ today, we understand, is our only authority and our high priest. And there's just nothing in the New Testament scriptures of the law of Christ that gives any kind of a statement, a clue as to why we should worship on the Sabbath day. Someone says, well, Jesus kept the Sabbath, yes, but he was under the Old Testament law, as the Jews were in his day. And it applied to those people at that time. When we look at our singing, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, we're to sing and praise and worship to God. Someone says, well, I don't see anything wrong with instrumental music. Well, I'll tell you what, I don't either. Not from a moral perspective, but it's not a moral question whether an instrument is right or wrong based on the morals. It's the question of what God has stated in his positive law. You know, the question of a piano or a musical instrument as a moral law, it's morally fine to do it in our homes or out in a secular type setting. There's nothing wrong with that. Mechanical instruments of music are not wrong in and of themselves. But when we come to worship, God has decreed what he wants. He specifies the kind of music. As he says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 15, let us offer the fruit of our lips. Read the whole verse. Hebrews 13 and verse 15. Therefore, by him, let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. So we see that's what God wants. And there's just nothing in the New Testament about worshiping on the Sabbath, about worshiping or taking up a collection another day of the week. There's just nothing about that. And there's nothing in the New Testament that states anything by God's law as far as the music that he wants, except for vocal music, which is not instrumental. You know, it may seem good to us. It may seem good. We could argue about it from a moral viewpoint. I had an opportunity many years ago to speak to a youth group and some adults at a Methodist church gathering. And I talked about what the Church of Christ is all about and why we don't use instrumental music in worship. Well, I had a man come up to me afterward, and he said, well, I just don't see anything wrong with worshiping God with instruments of music. In addition to our singing, he says, when I walk in the sanctuary or auditory. He says, when I hear those musical instruments and everything start playing, it just gives me such a strong feeling. Well, yeah, it does me too. It's up to me, my own personal choice. Then I would not only have a piano up here, I would have a full orchestra because I like that kind of thing. And there's nothing immoral about it, is it? It's not arguing about how we feel or what our personal thoughts or preferences are. It's a matter of what God says, to obey his word. It may seem good to us, but that ox cart probably seemed right to David, didn't it? Or about that fire that Nadab and Abihu argued, or they offered. And, was there anything, again, morally wrong? No. But God gave the command, and he expected them to obey it. But those things that we add to our worship or to the church cannot be argued just on the basis of morality. Be baptized, Mark 16:16. Somebody says, well, I don't see any significance about going down into the water and being immersed. Well, it's not a matter of morality. It's a matter of what's right because God said so. This is what he said to be saved. An example, Acts 20 and verse 45, where we find the household of Cornelius, the first Gentile converts. And what did Peter say? He commanded them to be baptized in the name. It's a command, a positive law statement that God gave. And we violate that and choose not to be baptized. We haven't violated God's moral principles or moral law. We violated his positive law of what he said to do, to be saved. Buried with him in baptism. It's not sprinkling and pouring, although that may seem satisfactory to a lot of people. But we can't pass judgment of what the Lord said on the basis of our moral sense of what we think it ought to be or what we ought to do or not do. So what we're saying is we see that these positive laws are to be respected just as much as those laws which involve morality. It does not take faith to be obedient to moral law, does it? There are a lot of people, and I know many, who are atheists, who don't believe in the Bible, have no faith in Christ, and they would never think of taking a life or murder or stealing or committing adultery or any of those things. They are good, moral people, and it just doesn't take any faith in God or his word to obey moral law. Everyone can understand why these moral laws ought to be kept. What takes faith is doing something when we don't see any point in it, like being baptized, immersed in water, or having instrumental music, or partaking of a Lord's Supper on a Friday, when we don't see any moral value in doing it or not doing it. But we have faith in what God said to do. An illustration of that is I go to the doctor and I've got some ailment, and the doctor says, well, I want you to go home and get some rest. Well, I can understand that, and I don't argue with the doctor. It doesn't take any faith for me to do what the doctor says in that case. But I'll tell you what, if the doctor tells me to take this awful tasting medicine, I can't see any benefit in it, and I don't want that stuff, but I just go right on and I do it, well, that takes faith, doesn't it? Faith in what the doctor said, what he prescribed. And it takes faith to do what God said, whether we understand it or not, regardless of whether or not we could reason in our own minds and try to argue it and justify it from a moral perspective. But doing what God says even when we don't understand. Naaman couldn't see any point of being washed in the River Jordan, could he? Why do I have to go down there? Why can't I use one of these other rivers? But it was only when he had enough faith to do what God said that he was cleansed of his leprosy. You see, our faith must be obedient. That's James 2, isn't it? Faith and works. There are many who would never, ever intentionally disobey a moral law or principle. They're good moral people, but they don't have faith in God's positive laws and his authority. And so it takes a lot of faith. Let me repeat that. It takes a lot of faith just to sing without an instrument. Oh, but the piano and the sounds so good. Well, it may sound good to me too, but it's not a matter of whether it's morally right or wrong or how it sounds or how I feel about it. I have faith to do what God did. It takes a lot of faith just to partake of these simple elements in the Lord's Supper. Someone says, well, I make a great fruit punch, or I make some spicy, icing for the bread. That may be okay from a moral standpoint. Nothing wrong with fruit punch or icing on a cake, but we have to follow what God says in his word and what God has specified in the positive laws, the fruit of the vine and the unleavened bread. It takes a lot of faith to follow God's pattern for the work and the worship of the church. Like we mentioned, I think last week or the week before about authority, well, people will say, well, look at all the good that we can accomplish. And so there are many churches of Christ that are involved in this congregational cooperation, where they may set up one church to be the sponsoring church or some evangelist, and then they solicit funds from all these other local churches. And then those funds are sent and used by the elders of that particular church to sponsor this missionary or evangelist. Or there's the support of human institutions, like we've seen throughout, the last 100 years nearly now, in which churches take their collection and they send it to some benevolent institution, like an old folks home or an orphan home. I have a lot of experience dealing with some of those throughout my early years of preaching. And, well, that may not seem like such a bad thing. Well, look at all the good that's being accomplished and how we're helping these needy people. And aren't we supposed to help orphans and widows in their affliction? Yes, but that's an individual command, not for the church surrender its funds under a board of directors. These are things not morally wrong in and of themselves, you see, but God has given us a pattern. And he expects us to follow the pattern for the work of the church. What about Hebrews 10:25? Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as a matter of some is, but you can quote the verse, and we use it often to encourage our brethren to be present with the people of God. Assemble with the saints. Oh, I don't understand. I don't understand why God would tell me to go to church when I can get close to him just by getting out here on a Sunday morning, a beautiful day, just walking through the park or the wood. I can get close to God that way, can't you? Yeah, I can. I've done that many times. But on the first day of the week, God expects me to assemble and meet with the saints. And whether I can see any real value from a moral perspective or for my own personal needs, that doesn't matter. It's what God said. And if I have faith, then I'm going to be obedient to God's positive law, which tells me what I must do in order to be faithful unto him. Well, it's a very simple lesson, but you see how people often argue about things from a moral perspective when it really doesn't involve a standard of morality of what's right or wrong. It involves what God said, that God gives us positive laws, some specific, some in a generic way. And we're not to disobey. We're not to take away, and we're not to add to it. We can't create or make our own laws. To make positive laws for God's salvation, for the work of the church, for the worship of the church, to make positive laws on behalf of God in these regards is to displease God. It's a violation. And just because I'm not in violation of some moral law doesn't mean that I can disobey God when He gives us a positive law from His authority, from His word. Well, the point is we have faith. Keep God's law. We understand His moral standard of morality is given in the Scriptures over and over. But that's not enough. We have to also obey God's positive statements and commands, realizing what the Lord says and to do the will of God. That's what it is. And it comes down to having faith to do the will of God. Jesus did. He constantly, as we'll see through the Gospel of John, saying, I came not to do my own will, but the will of Him who sent me. And He tells the people that day and time over and over, I am doing my Father's will. He didn't argue with it. Even though He was the Son of God, He did whatever God said, whatever God's plan was. He did the will of God. And that must be our determination, to do God's will when it involves a moral law, but also to do God's will when there are positive laws that are given, which we may not understand, and which may have nothing really to do with morality in and of itself. But God simply says, do it or don't do it. And He means for us to keep His commandments, to do His will. And that's God's will for you this morning. If you're not a Christian, you're wandered astray. As we sing this song, we encourage you, if you need our prayers or need our help, if you have questions or whatever we can do to help you, then you can come and let us know your desires.